welcome back. Let's look at the agenda. So we're entering our seventh week, and we're going to start a brand new module, the Node.js and Express server-side programming using Node.js and Express, and that will take us a couple weeks to finish. Then we'll have spring break. We'll come back. We'll do database development. Before we jump into Node.js, I want to just go over a part of the assignment, in particular the login, and just wanted to run by you one potential way of implementing it. And you're welcome to reuse this source code or not, but this just to go over a couple of ideas. Right? So here's the example that I have for you. It's an experiment login. So here's a simple login page with a home, register and login, and presumably there would be a profile page and an admin page, and presumably also a logout link, but they're not visible currently because I am not currently logged in. Right? So I'm going to first register. Dundo. Then whatever. Actually, no. Let's use Dan, and Dan. I'll register, and it takes me to a profile. Notice that the register link goes away, and the login link goes away because I am currently logged in, and I'm now accessing the profile, which was originally not there. Right? It wasn't originally there. It shows my username and password, and allows me to add additional pieces of information such as my email, first name, last name, and change my password if I provide my passwords. If I go home and I come back to profile, I still have my information there, even though I navigated away from different pages. So it does maintain state within the same session, right? Within the same browser session. Although if I refresh, everything's gone. Okay, and this is okay until we start talking about being able to maintain session on the server. Okay, and we're going to start learning about that today, right? And that's one of the requirements in your project, is that you have some login and user management support, and that session is maintained. All right, this should not happen in your final project. That if I refresh, all of a sudden you're not logged in anymore. All right, all of a sudden your application doesn't know who you are. Okay, so be careful. Right, always test to see that your application, when you reload, it still knows who you are. Okay, we'll learn how to do that starting today. We'll talk about maintaining session on the server and whatnot, okay? But for this assignment that you're working on, it is okay to lose session because we haven't learned how to maintain sessions yet. Anyway, so let me do that again. I'm going to register again, Dan. I log in, and I can set data, right? I can say Dan. Boom, and then at boom.com. I can update my profile, and I get a message at the top saying user updated successfully. I can log out. And notice that if I log out, it goes back home. I don't have access to my profile anymore, and I get register and log in. Now, if I log in using Dan again, Dan. I go back to my profile, and I have the same information I had earlier, Dan, Boone, and my email. Everybody okay? So this is more or less what we would like to be able to implement, something like that. I can still log out. There's a couple of users that are already in the system. I can log in as Alice. And Alice, this is her information. I can log out. I can log in as Bob. And Bob is in the admin role. And because Bob is in the admin role, he has access to the admin page. Okay? And the admin page right now is just, just a placeholder. Make sense? So this has more or less all the features that we're asking you to implement. Being able to go in and out or whatnot, and what's available to you. So let's look at how this is implemented, and you might want to use some of these ideas. All right? Okay. A lot of them are based on storing the current user in the root scope. Okay. And then showing or highlighting or displaying different links at different times depending on your role, depending on the user exists or not. So let's look at the implementation. So here's the index page. This is the index page, and it just declares a container, and it has a view. This is where all the various pages are going to be loaded, right, dynamically, and it includes views, header view. Everybody okay? All right. So let's look at the header first. So the header is inside of views, and we can look at the header here, header view. There it is. And what it does is that it declares all the links at the top, right? The home link, the register link, the login link, the profile link, the admin link, logout links. They're all up there. Yes? The ones that are way up there. Also, it declares a controller that is going to feed it information that it needs. Okay. One of the things that it's going to feed it is the location object, which we've already demoed a couple weeks ago, right? So I'm not going to go over that, but basically it's just highlighting the pill, yes, based on the URL, right? If it's /home, it highlights this one pill. If it's /register, it highlights this one, and so on and so forth. Do you need me to go over that? We did that a couple weeks ago, right? Everybody okay with that? All right. There's a couple other things here. The home, the register, login, all these links are, notice they're all notifying the router of the intent of the user. Yes, they're not actually navigating anywhere. So somewhere in a config.js file, the routing is configured, right? And we did that already. Everybody should be familiar with that, right? So I'm not going to go over that either. What I am going to look at here is that, notice that some of these links have a ng-hide attribute. See that? And as you might guess, ng-hide hides the element. It does not show the element if the expression is truthy. Truthy is a JavaScript concept that means something that is not null, it's not undefined, it's not zero, it's not false, right? It's not empty string. All those mean that is truthy, okay? It's something that is somewhat true. So in this case, the expression is current user. See that? So current user presumably is a variable, right, in some scope. Actually, it's a variable that is in the root scope. Yes? There's have been several back and forth in Piazza. What do I do with the current user? And we're saying, put it in the root scope. Yes? Also, I believe that's what the assignment says, to use the root scope to store the current user. Is that what it says? I think it says that, right? Anyway, once it's put in the root scope, it's available everywhere. It's the closest you'll get to a global variable, okay, in Angular. So there's this global variable called current user. If it's null, then this will show, right? If it's not null, this will hide. Make sense? And this is correct, right? Register, I should not be able to register unless there is no current user, correct? If there is a current user, I don't want to see the register link. Makes sense. Okay? Same thing with login. If there's someone already logged in, there is a current user, I want to hide this link. Yes? So that's why this says this link, this li, this pill is hidden if there is a current user. So basically, don't show register and don't show login if there is a current user. That's what this says. Everybody okay? All right. Instead, it says if there is a user, I want to show these two. Right? If there's a user, I want to show ng show. Ng show, like the name suggests, shows this element if the expression is truthy. You know, just like there's truthy, there's falsy, right? Falsy means, you know, if it's any of null, not defined, empty string, zero length, right? Those are all falsy. Truthy is if it's none of those, right? So if current user is not null, then I am going to show logout. Yes. If there is a user, I also want to show the profile link. See that? Everybody good? All right. You'll notice that the logout link. You'll notice that the logout link is the only link that does not have a router. See that? They all have hash home, hash register, hash login, hash profile, hash admin. Right? They all have a route except logout, because there is no logout page. I don't want to navigate to a logout page if I click on the logout. Instead, if I click on logout, I want to navigate to home. Yes? I want to log out the person, right, and then navigate to home. So it's a little bit different. Logout's a little bit different. Okay? It's the only one who's a little bit different. Instead, logout, if you'll notice, is the only one that notifies the controller. See that? Because it needs to do something. It needs to make the current user null, right? Meaning there is no, it's going to clear out the current user, so there is no current user. And after that, I'm going to programmatically navigate to the home page. Yes? Because there's no current user. Everybody okay? Yes? Yes?
Sort of a related question, but how does the view differentiate between variables in the scope and the root scope? Or does it not matter?
So root scope is global, right? So there's no differentiation, right? It is available everywhere. If the controller also declares a current user, the same rules of scoping apply, right? The nearest, the narrowest scope always wins. Right, so if the controller creates also a current user, it would be obfuscating the root scope, current user, and you should try to avoid that. And you know, many suggest that that's one of the weaknesses in AngularJS, that if you have these nested scopes, right, any controller inside would obfuscate variables declared in the higher scope, right, and that's why the way we tend to do that in object-oriented is that we create namespaces, right? We make sure that namespaces are, don't overlap, right? The namespace is the object. We always try to use local variables as much as possible, and don't broaden our scope elsewhere. Yes. Anyway, we'll get to how to break out namespaces a little later, right? To avoid these kinds of issues. Okay. The other one that I like to point out is the admin link. In the admin link, we also have an ng show, meaning we want to show the admin link if the current user is in the admin role. So presumably, users can be in a particular role or can have several roles, right? So in this particular case, Bob is the only one in the admin role. Right, that's why Bob saw the admin link. Yes, and so presumably users, they'll have a roles array attached to each object of the user. Yeah, and we're asking, hey, array of roles of the current user, do you contain an admin in your array of roles? Is there one? Right, that's what this question is, right? What this does is iterates over that array looking for the string admin. If it finds it, right, it'll say an index. If it doesn't find it, it'll come back with -1, -1. Yes? So this says show this link if this is greater than or equal to 0. If you find an admin string in the array. Make sense? Everybody okay? Everybody still with me? So that's pretty easy. So let's see how this all ties with everything else. Right? Okay, so let's look at register first. Let's look at register. So if we have the configuration that I'm not going to go into too much, but basically these are all the routes, right? If I click on home, I go to the home view. If I click on register, I go to register view, and login, profile, admin. Right? And my default is home. Yes, we saw this already last week, right? So I don't need to go over that, right? And some of them have controllers, some of them don't. Right? So I'm going to navigate now to the register view, which has its own register controller. Yes? Right? So I'm going to go. I'm going to log out, and then I'm going to go register. So in register, I have just username, password, and verify password. So let's look at that view. Let's look at the view, how it's implemented. Okay, so let's look at the view. And it's implemented in register view. And you will find here what you would expect, right? You find just a form. It has at the top this div that would allow me to put error messages. Okay, which right now it's not showing. Notice that it's not showing. But if I click on register and don't provide anything, it gives me an error message at the top. Yes? So that's this div up here, right? It's using Bootstrap alert and alert danger class. See that? Right? And it only shows if the variable, presumably handled by the controller, yes, if that's different than null, then it shows the message, the actual message. Okay? All right. So let's see how that works. So we have all these input fields are tied to a model, username, user password 2. And the button is, when I click on it, it calls on the controller register, and it passes the user object. That's all it does. Everybody okay? All right. So let's look at the controller where the magic happens. So the controller first initializes the message to be null, so there's no message at the top, right? So it doesn't show any error messages. And it declares the event handler, and it implements the event handler down here. It receives the user. Everybody okay? It again nulls the message just in case the person fixed the problems with the form, right? It clears the message again, and then it does some validation. For instance, it checks to see if the object is null, meaning the person submitted the form but never provided any data. Right? So the user object is null. They never put a username, not a password, and a password too, nothing. So we put the message, scope message, please fill in the required fields, and we return immediately. Next week we'll look at Angular has its own validation. Right? We'll talk about Angular validation next week. But I just wanted to show you how you would create something similar. Yes? We check to see if the username is falsy. I'm sorry. Yeah, if the username is falsy. Right? Notice it says not user.username. Yes? Meaning that if the username is false, or the username is null, or the username is not defined, or it's empty string, or falsy. That's what JavaScript uses. If it's falsy, then it says please provide the username, and it returns. If the password is falsy, or the password too is falsy, we provide a message. If they're not the same, we provide a message. Okay? Everybody okay? All right. All right, so, and you can think of other validations that you might want to do, but I'm just giving you some examples. All right? If we get to over here, Then we've validated everything. We'll first check to see if there is a user with that username. Let's check to see if there's already a user with that username. If there is, we're not going to let them register with the same username. So we're using a service that says find user by username, and we pass the username. Okay. If it comes back with it's different than null, that means that there is a user with that username, and we validate again and say, oh, that user already exists, and we return. Finally, if we get down here, that user does not exist, and we use the user service to create the user, and we pass the user in the scope. Yes? And the user service comes back to the new user, and we set, instead of using root scope dot current user, I put that inside of the service as well, because the service is already kind of global, right? So in the set current user, I pass new user, and the only thing that does is says root scope current user equal the current user. That's all it does. And then I programmatically, notice I programmatically navigate to profile. See that? If the registration was successful, I'm going to change my URL to /profile, and that will navigate me to profile page. See that? Everybody okay? Let's look at this service, how these are implemented. So let's look at find user by username. So here's the service. This is a service. It is using root scope, so it's going to ask for root scope to be injected. And then it declares locally, kind of like an API or kind of like a model. It's encapsulating all that it needs in this object called model. It encapsulates the current data of all the users that I know about so far, and the API that can be used to manipulate this data model. Okay. Right now we have just 3 users: Alice, Bob, and Charlie. You'll notice that they all have username and passwords, and they all have roles at the end. You see that? So Alice is a student. Bob is a faculty and an admin, and Charlie is an employee. Okay? In the roles. So in the find user by username, okay, it's going to iterate over that array in the model, right? Right? It's going to iterate, and it's going to compare the username that you pass with everybody's username. Right? If we find it, we return that user. Otherwise, we're going to return null. Okay. In the create user, which we also use, we receive user, and we create an instance, a brand new instance of user using the username and password that you pass us, and we push it to the current array of users. Everyone okay? Is this too fast? Too slow? Am I going too fast or too slow? Slow? Fast? Just right? Okay. Right. I don't want to dwell on a lot of this we've seen so far. We've seen services. We've seen yes. Right. So in previous examples, we've used this variable API. Remember? Done that and returned the API. Yes. We're making it just a little bit more useful in that we are also in that same variable, right? We're putting in there the data that we are manipulating, right? You know, it's a common style, right, to wrap the accessors, right, all the setters and getters, right, together with the data that those accessors and mutators are manipulating, the users. So users, so the model is kind of everything, right? A data model might include both things, right? The data that's being manipulated plus all the behaviors that go along with that data. So it's a little bit object-oriented, right? The data, it's the object that contains not only the data, but then all the manipulators that manipulate that data, right? And that's what's being returned. So whoever receives this user service, they actually have direct access to the data. See that? which again might be a good practice or not, right? You might like that or not, that you have access directly to the data. A better implementation might have been to keep this out here, right? Keep it outside, and only the functions can access that local variable, right? This is more convenient for whoever gets a hold of the user service. And in here, we have all the accessors and mutators, right? Access the users in the model, right? Or push data into that model. See that? Yes. All right. So create pushes and find finds. Very good. Are you okay? So so if I registered as Dan, Dan is now in that array. Okay. And now I am in the profile. So in the profile, let's look at now the profile. In the profile, in the view, the profile, we have two alerts. One for displaying messages and one for displaying errors. The only reason I did that is that I'm using different this should be danger because it's an error. Yeah, I wanted to distinguish that if it's a message, if it's a normal message, I wanted to display green. If it's an error, I want to display it in red. Okay, so we have these two divs at the top which display whether there's a regular message or if it's an error. Okay. Anyway, down below is just like you would expect. It's just a form, right? And it's mapped to the current user. Where is the current user? It's in the root scope. It's a global variable, right? Everybody can see this, right? And who added it to the root scope? When we registered, right? In the registered, right? We put it in the root scope, right? In the service. Remember, here's a service. Service. Now, one of the things that it does is that it sets the current user, right? When we register, we call set current user, and the only thing that set current user does is that it adds the user in the current user in the root scope. See that? That's all it does, right? And get current user just returns from root scope. This is it's a little nicer, right? Instead of using it as like a global variable, we're at least we're encapsulating it in some object, right? That gives it some protection. So anyway, in the profile, we render the current usernames, the username of the current user. We render the password. These two allow us to change the password if we want to, and we add a couple other fields such as first name, last name, and email. And if we click on the link down below, the button, it will update the user using the current user. Right. So let's look at that implementation in the server's profile, I think. Yeah, here. Here's a controller, right? It initializes both error messages, error and message to null. It loads the current user from the user service. It says user service, get me the current user. Okay, so here's a validation. If there is no current user, if somehow you came to profile page without having logged in or registered, I'm going to kick you back to the home page. Right? So this is kind of like a soft protection. Right? I'm protecting this page. If you, for instance, say notice that I'm not registered, but I know that the path is profile. Yes? Click on profile, notice that it's not letting me go to the profile because I haven't logged in. Yes? Right? Only if I log in. But now the profile page works. You see that? Right? So I can't just type profile here. It won't work. If I log out and then if I try to type profile and navigate to that page, it just kicks me back to home. It checks to see, is there a current user? No, I'm going to kick you back to home, right? But this is a soft protection. Real protection will come later when we do server-side security, right? All these techniques of protecting some pages and whatnot, these are all soft protections. These can all be thwarted by JavaScript developers. Okay, they can always fool the browser into thinking that it's in a particular state that it's not. Okay, all right. So real protection will come when we do server-side security. All right, and that we'll start talking about that today. All right, so I'm in the profile page. I have an event handler for the update user. If they click on the update user, we could do some validation here. I haven't done any validation. We could do the same validations that we did when we registered, right? Make sure that the passwords are the same, that the emails are emails, that and things like that, right? If we pass the validation, we call update user, and we pass the user object. Login views. This is model. Client service. I think it's this one. No, that's not it. Update user. This one is update user. There it is. So update user, what it does is that it first finds the user by username, right? Using the same function that I have here locally. Finds the user. Now that I have the user, make sure that the user is not null. If it didn't find the user, this would not work. If it finds a user, then it changes the first name, the last name, and the passwords. Obviously, you would do some validation, and it returns the current user that you just updated. Okay. If it didn't find the user, then it returns null, which would be kind of weird, right? That we're in the profile page and we try to update it and it doesn't find the user, even though you're logged in, right? But that could happen. Once we have updated the user, it checks to see that the user has been successfully updated, meaning that if it returns null or not. If it does, then it returns say that it was successfully updated, and it sets the current user to this current user that we just updated. Okay? All right. All right. What about logout? Logging out. So earlier I said that logout was a little bit different, right? Logout was a little bit different in that it called a logout function. When you clicked on it, and we wanted to navigate to the home page. So this logout function is implemented here in the header controller. So let's go to that header controller. So that header controller, first of all, it's providing the location for the nav, right, so that it can highlight the correct pill depending on where you are in the location. So we're providing that to the scope. Also, we are declaring the event handler for the logout, right? And that logout, the only thing that it does is that it clears the current user, right? Meaning it sets the root scope current user to null, right? And then dynamically navigates to the home page. And when we navigate to the home page, now that the current user is set to null, all the links in the header, go back to showing or hiding depending on the fact that the current user is not null, right? And that's exactly what's happening, right? We logged in. When we click on logout, it goes back to null, and everybody hides, right? The profile hides, the admin hides, and then the register and login show, because now the current user is null. Yes? Everybody okay? Another thing that I wanted to point out is notice how when I hover, right, that the cursor is a hand. Yes? And the reason they're hands is that in the header view, all the hyperlinks have an actual value. Yes? And have an href attribute, has an href attribute. And that's all the browser needs to render the hand over a hyperlink. But you'll notice that the login, that the logout doesn't have an href. You see that? It doesn't have an href. So by default, this hyperlink would not show a hand, right? It would show, I'll show you. Right? It would show like this. Log in. Oops. Log in. Alice. I log in. When I hover over it, notice that it's not a hand. You see that? It sees the like plain text. Okay, that's not acceptable. Right? Anything that gives the idea that it should be clickable, it should have the correct cursor over it, right? And it's rendering like that because it doesn't have the hash. It doesn't have the href, right? Now I removed the href because the href makes no sense in this link. It makes no sense because href it gives a hint that I am going somewhere. The logout doesn't go anywhere. It's being handled by the controller, and then the controller is going back to home. See? So in many cases, you're not going to have an href, but you still want the hand. You still want the hand. All right, so to achieve that, I added this style. I added the style saying that all hyperlinks should use the cursor pointer, regardless of whether they have the href or they don't have the href. Yes? Okay, so just be careful, right, that as you're using hyperlinks, oftentimes you will want hyperlinks that don't have the href in them. Okay? And be careful to style them correctly so that users understand that it's clickable, right? You notice that it's now styled correctly. See that? All right. What else? I think that's it. Admin is right. You already saw the array, right? You saw that the Bob has an array of admin, and that's why the admin link displays. Yeah, I think that's it. Any questions? This is available in GitHub, and you should take a look at it and just grab a couple of ideas if you want for the assignment. Yes. It's actually, I don't know if I have the link for this particular GitHub. GitHub sign out. Sign in again. Is the is it web dev? Yeah, I think it's in web dev, and you have the is it portal here? Public portal lectures experiments login right here. Okay, it's this directory. So let me post it to Piazza for everybody. Okay, so this GitHub is actually this entire portal that we're using. The entire portal is available on GitHub if you want to see all sorts of examples there. All right. Okay. Let me see. let me go back to I did want to go over the assignment, the proof of concept assignment. So it's a little bit more involved for the graduate students, but I want to go over it anyway. So, all right. So the proof of concept has two pieces, right? One of the pieces is becoming familiar with the data model that you've created for your particular project. That's one of them. And the second one is optional, but it attempts to have you become familiar with the third-party API that you might be using for this project. Not all of you are using third-party APIs. It's not required, but nonetheless, you should exercise it and become familiar with it. Okay, so what this asks you to do is pretty much implement similar similar things that we've already implemented in our lectures. That for each one of your objects, we want to create tables that allow us to interact with those objects. Okay. Right, so we want to create CRUD operations. So we've already implemented this, right? So let me just show you an example. Right, so we've implemented, for instance, OMDB. Where is it? Movies. Where is it? Mongo experiments, AngularJS, movie admin. Here's one, right? So experiments. And then OMDB, AngularJS, and then we have movie admin. Okay, if you remember this, right? We looked at this example a couple weeks ago, and so what we're asking you to do is for each one of your entities, right? Whether they're users, recipes, cars, sports. News items, or whatever your domain objects are, right? Okay, you should have one of these pages that allows you to create, update, delete, right, and manipulate your data. All right. Okay, so in my case, my domain object are movies. Yes. Right. So I can create new instances of movies. I can delete them, I can update them, I select them, right? I can do all the CRUD operations. Yes? And that's something you need to become familiar with as you exercise your data model, right? So that's one of them. So you need to create one of these. Just for each page above, create controllers and handlers events that allow you to do the CRUD operations, updates the model, provide data corresponding view. Each of the controllers follow best practice, blah, 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 right? Right. So that's for each one, right? So you might have, if it's an event calendar, you might have users, right? You might have calendars, you might have events, right? And your UML might look something like this, right? A user has many calendars, and each calendar has many events. Something like that, right? So you should have one of these pages that allows you to create users, remove users, update users, create calendars, remove calendars, update calendars, create events, delete events, and things like that, right? This will allow you to exercise the fact that these are arrays, that each array has objects, each object has name value pairs, right? And they have to be rendered, right, in each one of the in its correct way, right? And we have plenty of examples you can reuse, right? You can go and from the experiments, and you can just swipe out the entire code and just manipulate it and make it work for you, All right. But it's supposed to follow good practices. You're supposed to have a service, right? So for each one of these, you'll need a user service, a calendar service, an event service, right? You'll need a controller for each one of them. You'll need a view for each one of them. Okay. So it's getting you going. You know, you're going to need these services anyway, right? And when you start implementing these, right? So it's not asking you to make the pages beautiful or make them the final layout of your page. You're still thinking about that, what the wireframes are, and you might be moving things around still. But this allows you to start thinking about what your data model is. Okay, right? For those that are working with third-party APIs, we have other experiments that exercise that, right? We have here, what was it? OMDB API, right? We have Angular implementation that does that, right? So we have, so let's look at that. We have experiment, OMDB, Angular, experiments, OMDB API, Angular, and then no routing. Okay, so this one, you know, I would expect that you would build something like this, right? Where you can search, right, retrieve data, display it, and if I click on one, I see the details for that particular object, whatever your domain object is, right? Some of you are using Yelp, so this might be restaurants, yes? And then when you click on a particular restaurant, on the right-hand side, you get, I don't know, where, you know, the address where it's located, maybe a couple of images, right? Maybe a couple of reviews. Or some of you are using Yumly for recipes, right? So you might type here some recipes, right? And you search and you get several recipes that match your criteria. And then you click on a particular recipe, and then you get on the right-hand side, you get the details about that particular recipe. Make sense? So this will get you going, practicing, you know, how do I interact with this third-party API? Okay? All right? All right, so that's what the proof of concept asks you, starts making you think about, hey, this is the types of query that I need. Will I be able to do it? You know, will I be able to receive the data that I need for my to build whatever I need to build? And the earlier you can do this, the better. Especially if you're doing third-party APIs, you want to identify any limitations that your third-party API might have. It's okay if you discover that your API wasn't going to give you the data you thought it was going to give you, right? If it has some limitations, we can go back and reshuffle some of the requirements that we had agreed on when you submitted your proposal, right? You know, as you investigate more and more, you'll find out more details about your particular API. Okay? We can revisit the wireframes. We can revisit that proposal if you want to discuss that with me. All right? Okay. Any questions? Yes.
How, I guess, comprehensive does the concept be? Like every single function that you described?
So it should be driven by your use cases, right? If your use case says that you can search by a recipe by ingredient, then you should have a page that says, give me ingredient or ingredients or whatever, right? And then the recipes that match that ingredient. Right. So your use case, you should have, for each use case, you should have something like this that allows you to exercise that use case. Okay. You don't need to show all the data, but you should show the data that you describe in your use case, right? If you say that user will be able to see the ingredient or the steps to create this meal, then on the right-hand side, you should be able to display those steps. They don't have to be pretty, right? But you want to be able to show that, yes, I can get that data, and somehow I can render it. Okay, we'll massage it and make it pretty at some point, right, to make it look like whatever your wireframes are. But you want to make sure that you do have access to the data. right? Make sense? All right. All right, let's start with server-side programming. So in our agenda today, we are talking about server-side programming. We're entering the 7th week, and we're introducing Express. So we have been using Node.js a little bit, and let me show you. Oh, sorry. Been using Express a little bit, but we've been using it very, very limited. Right now, let me just. Uh-oh. What? The video call ended because the computer. Oh, that sucks. Sorry. You're about to. Well, I don't know if it recorded. Can somebody check? Maybe later. All right, so let me stop screen sharing. So up to this point, we've been using Express in a very limited sense, right? We've only been using it to host our static content, right? We've been, so here's our Node.js instance, and it's hosting several static content under the public directory. Yes? And here you have HTML, I have JavaScript, and I have CSS. And our browser has gone and asked for this index page, has downloaded it, copied it locally, and then gone back to the server asking for more JavaScript, more CSS, downloaded it, right? And then the JavaScript just ran inside an Angular framework. Yes? And that Angular framework, you know, as the user interacted with the Angular controllers, we've gone out to third-party APIs to retrieve data using Ajax, which then responded with JSON that we dynamically rendered. Yes? Well, we want to start doing the same thing that these third-party APIs are doing. These third-party APIs are making available data in their databases available through these URLs. We would like to be able to do the same thing. We would like to be able to have our own database and make the data available to anybody who cares, you know, through the use of URLs. Yes? And in particular, we would like to make it available to our Angular client, in particular, right? But you know, just like the Angular client can go fetch the data, anyone else using the same URL should be able to also access the data. Just like I can go to OMDB and retrieve data, anybody else can go to OMDB, right? Well, OMDB has an endpoint, a web service endpoint. I'm going to have my own web service endpoint and make my data available. Well, not all of it, maybe, you know, only the data that I care to make public. Yes? Make sense? So let's see how we do that. The making data available in this fashion, right, has its own name, right? We call these endpoints. Endpoint is just a URL. It's a fancy name for a URL, right? A particular URL. Now that endpoint is a URL that doesn't behave like we would expect a URL to behave. Typically, when we think of a URL, is, you know, I click this URL and I go to a page, something that is consumable by a human being. Yeah, it's an HTML document. That's typically how we think about it. But we're expanding the idea of a URL to be not of human consumables, but it could be something that can be consumed programmatically. Yes, like this one right here, right? this data that was being provided was meant not to be consumed by humans, but it was meant to be consumed by some program that consumed that data stream and then render it for human consumption. Right. So that's why we give it a special name. And to implement this, we implement what are called web services. Web services. Web services was an idea in the late century that people came up with this idea that said we have all these disparate systems, right? And they all have different data. Each one has different databases. Each one has different infrastructures. Each one has different programming languages. How do we make all these things talk to one another? Right? I am Ford Motor Company, and I want to talk to my tire suppliers, my windshield suppliers. And I want to talk to the bank because I need loans, and I want to talk to my distributors. I want to talk to my car dealers. I have a lot of people that I want to talk to. And each one has their own infrastructure. It's nightmare, right? You talk, you have this infrastructure. You talk Java, your C#, your you have all this plethora of technologies. How do we have this? So the idea was that, hey, what if we wrap, right? Whatever the infrastructure is, what if we can wrap it, right, in some standard, a representation that hides away all those details. What if we all talk the same language? And it became very, very popular to talk XML. XML became very, very popular because it allowed everybody now to talk to one another in the same language. Right? And this ASCII language was very, very, very verbose. Right? Lots and lots of pointy brackets. But everybody spoke the same language, right? I didn't have to speak to you in your native language. I could speak to you in XML, right? And then each one of the infrastructures then converted the XML to some internal representation, blah blah blah. Yes, and now we can all talk to one another. Well, today the same idea has continued, right? But more and more we're creating lots and lots of applications that are moving from desktop to the web, right? And since the lingua franca in the web is JavaScript, it makes sense that the data that goes through the wire is JavaScript friendly, right? So instead of these web services talking XML, they now talk JSON, and XML, right? They might also talk both JSON and XML. So web services is an idea that came in vogue at the end of the last century with the intent of being able to integrate lots and lots of disparate systems, right? Ford wanted to say, hey, bank, I need a loan because I'm going to buy 1 million tires from him, and I want to buy so many millions of windshields, right? And the way I communicated with the bank, I wanted to have a standard way to talk to the bank. I wanted a standard way to talk to my tire supplier, a standard way to talk to my windshield supplier, and all my trucks and and be able to all talk the same. So anyway, so today we're using it for searching for movies and recipes and whatnot. Yes, makes sense. What a web service is, right? A little history there. So how do we create web services? Let's create web services. So we've been using Express. Now you can navigate to Express.js at its own website, and I encourage you to read through this website. Okay, we've only used about 10% of what Express can do. Right? Express is it's an API that allows us very, very easily to get a server up and running, right, and match URLs with executables, which is very, very powerful. Okay, we're going to be using the latest version, 4.x, and you'll notice that some of the code you'll find it very, very familiar to you. Okay, if you'll notice that these 2 lines of code, you should already have them in your server.js, don't you? Right, you have that piece of code there. You might also have in there something like this. App.listen and then some port that you're listening at, right? In your server.js. You might have a couple lines in also that make it friendly to be able to be executed in OpenShift or executed locally. Yes? That checks to see if there's an IP address or if there's a port number in OpenShift, and then it uses those instead. Otherwise, it uses 3000 and localhost locally. Yes? You should have that code in there. You should also see, some of you might already have, you might still have something like this that says hello world, or maybe you've already removed it, maybe, I don't know. But this is where it comes from, right? So let's visit this code again. What this says is that I want to create an instance of an Express server, and I want to listen to incoming HTTP requests at port 3000. Now, this is all what it says. What this line says is that Express can listen for incoming HTTP GET requests. See that? This says, hey, Express, listen for incoming GET requests, match it against this URL. If the URL matches, right, then execute the following function. Yes? Right? So what Express is doing is going to intercept incoming HTTP requests. It's going to pattern match the URL, and then it's going to call your function. It's going to parse. It's going to parse the server. Express is going to parse the incoming HTTP request. It's going to provide to us an object that represents that request. Okay, it's going to parse the URL. It's going to parse any incoming parameters, any path parameters, the IP address, where it's coming from, who generated, when it was generated, timestamp, any cookies that are coming from the browser, any headers, anything that comes from the browser, right? It's going to be available in this object REQ. It's going to pass it to you in this function, this callback function, right? And then it provides to you also another object that allows you to send data back to respond to whoever came with this request. Yes. In this particular case, it's just responding with, these 8 or 9 pieces of characters, right? This string. Yes. And the way it responds, it uses .send on the response. Yes. Everybody still with me? Right. In this way, we can write code that can participate in a HTTP dialogue. In an HTTP dialogue, there's a request or query made, and we respond to that query, right? And we can write here any code we want to be able to see what the browser has to say, and then to respond back to the browser whatever we want to respond. Everybody okay? Right now, we already automated some of this response, didn't we? We use public. Remember public? We configure our server to automatically respond to the root. Right? What we said here is that if any incoming requests come in, try to match the URL. Try to match the URL starting at the slash. Try to match it with anything, physical files that are located inside of the public directory. Right? So if we're here, try to go to slash experiments, blah 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 blah, right? Angular routing, that's going to physically match, right? Map to a directory called experiments, a directory in there called OMDB API, Angular, and then routing. You see that? And the one that does that is, sorry, the one that does that is this configuration. We say, whatever, try to match those to physical directories and files in the file system, starting at the public directory. That's what it says. Okay? Right. That's how we have been serving all our assignments and experiments throughout the semester. But that's very lame. Well, that's not lame. That's half of the story. That's half of the story. We're going to increase the expressionness of what we can do with Express by extending this capability right here, by extending that capability. We're going to build on that very, very heavily. Okay? We want to be able to distinguish between static content, yes, and dynamic data, like the data that we are fetching from OMDB API, right? OMDB API gives us dynamic data. We ask for a title, it comes back with an array. We ask for another title, it comes back with a different array. Yes? We want to have something similar, right? But we also want to be able to host static content, just plain old HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. Right? So and OMDB does this, right? OMDB API does this, right? If you don't have a query string, it just returns to you their index page. But instead, if you put a query string, it behaves differently. Yes? We want something similar. So what we're going to do is that anything that we want to respond with data, if we want to respond with something with data here, we're going to append all our URLs. We're going to append all our URLs that we mean for them to respond with data, right, with API, /API. Anything that follows /API is meant to be responding with data. Let me show you an example. Here we have a hello world example, right? On the server, we have created this app.get /API/hello, right? In this case, it's just returning it's actually not returning any data. It's actually returning, it's logging to the console of the server, say hello, but then it's responding with an HTML snippet. So send, in its wisdom, right? It's very powerful function. It parses the content, and it sees that this is not plain text. It's actually HTML. So it's smart enough to respond to the browser saying, hey, this is HTML, right? It's not plain text, right? It uses MIME types. MIME types allow browsers and email, right, to notify the sender and the receiver, right, to notify them what type of data is being passed along, right? Whether it's an image, whether it's a movie, whether it's a sound, or plain text or HTML. So send is smart enough to send back and tell the browser that this should not render this literally. It should render it as HTML. Right? And indeed, it renders it as HTML, as an H1. Okay. Here's another one, JSON. Right? If we click on API's JSON, the server has been configured, app.get API JSON has been configured to respond with a JSON object, with a local variable called course that contains JSON data, right? That contains a title attribute with a value, a seats attribute with a 23, and start with a date object instance, and then responds back to the client using the function .json. .json is like .send from earlier, but .send is smart enough to figure out what its content is, right? Whereas .json is only used to respond with JSON back to the client, right? And if we click on that, you'll see that what comes back is an actual JSON object, right, from the server. You see that, right? And this is where we're going. This is what we want to do, right? We want to be able to give out some URL, and somebody is going to be able to hit our URL and retrieve data. Okay, let's keep going. The data that can come back could be fairly sophisticated data. Excuse me. It could be an entire array. Right? Here's an entire array of courses that contains several instances of courses run with Java and C# and whatnot and right? If you click on that, it returns that array of courses, right? This is looking very similar to what OMDB is doing, right? OMDB is retrieving, is giving us back an array of movies, right? Here we're retrieving an array of courses, okay? And the way we did that is that we said if you see the following URL, right? We say, hey, Express, if you see an incoming HTTP GET with this URL, then execute the following function, right? We are going to respond with the following JSON, which is this courses. Make sense? Everybody still with me? All right. Okay. So it's this course, right? Course says course, right? There's an additional one that it's not listed there, is that I can provide an index, right? So I can provide an index. Look at that. I can ask for an individual, right? Or 0 for Java, or 1 for C#, or 2 for ASP.NET. You see that? Okay. So I can ask for all the courses, or I can ask for an individual course. Very much like what we did in using the OMDB API. Yes? They use a different syntax though, right? For searching for a pattern match of movies, they use S equal, and then you give it the title, yes? If you instead have the IMDb, they use a query string, I is equal, and then you provide the IMDb, yes? Right? Here we're following a different syntax. We're using a different structure of the URL. We're using what is called a RESTful syntax, right? We're using a RESTful API. A RESTful API allows us to expose data based on the structure of the URL, right? Because at the end of the day, what are we making available? Data, right? That's what we're making available. And data, you know, has attributes, has instances, has collections. Data might be related to other data, right? Okay, so RESTful APIs allow you to map these URLs to their corresponding data. So, for instance, if you have a UML diagram that looks like this, right? Say you have a user here, right, that has a library of movies. So you have one user has many movies, right? A RESTful API that would allow you to access this data, it would be something like this. It would be /API followed by user. Right? If you say user and you don't say which user, then the understanding is that you want all the users. So I return to you an array of users. If you continue and provide me with a unique ID of a user, I'll return the JSON object for that particular user. Make sense? If you keep going and you say that there is a relationship that there is one user is related to many movies, right? So if I ask for movie, now I am retrieving all the movies for that particular user. See that? And if I provide to you the ID of a particular movie, I will have access a particular movie for that particular user. That makes sense? Everybody okay? Notice that this hierarchy, right, the hierarchical nature of the path, the URL, allows me to access any data point in my database, my very simple database. Make sense? Everybody still with me? All right. Well, somebody might critique my data model and say, wait a minute. What do you mean a user has movies? What if I have another user, right, that also has some movies? But what if some of the movies are the same? Right? What if I have here in my library, right, you know, Blade Runner, and you also have another Blade Runner instance? Do we want to have, you know, Blade Runner twice? Yes, and any data analyst will cringe at that. Says, no, you don't want redundancy, right? Because if you have redundancy, you open up yourself for inconsistency, right? You should not allow to do that. Instead, there should be only one instance of Blade Runner. And there should be a mapping where you say, oh, these two users have the same movie. Yes? Right? So a better implementation might be that instead of doing that, is that you have a mapping in between. A user to movie mapping, where you have a movie here, and now Blade Runner is listed only once. Only once. And if you have two users, user 1 and user 2, you would have two instances here that says user 1, right, has movie 1. So say this has VR, right? And user 2 also has VR. So these two reference the same movie, and these two reference different users. Yes? So that's a better implementation. That's a better implementation. We usually refer to this table, right? So this is one to many to one. Yes? Now this data model is a little better, right? In that it allows you to navigate both ways, right? You can start at the user and navigate down to the movie, or you can start the other way. You can say API movie, right, /234. Right, so if I say just movie, that's all the movies. Yes? But if I say movie /234, then it might be just that one movie. Maybe it's Blade Runner. Yes? And then I can go further and say user, and this tells me all the users that have a relationship with that movie. See that? Right? So these two APIs allow me to navigate my data points both ways. I can go for I can get, given a user, I can tell you all that user, all the movies for that one user. Or I can go the other way. Given one movie, I can tell you all the users, right, for that one movie. Make sense? Right? So RESTful APIs, their goal is to give a mapping between, provide a syntax or structure for the URL so that it maps some data model. It allows you to navigate your data structure and your data model that you provide. Make sense? Everybody okay? All right. Another thing is that also RESTful APIs, not only do they map the reading of the data, the extraction of the data, which that's what we've been talking about, right? Retrieving data. It also looks to map to the ability of manipulating that data, right? If I want to read data, I would say get, right, /API /user, right? So if it's a get and you say user, that means that you are retrieving all the users. Yes? If it's a get, it's API /user and you provide an ID, some ID, then you are retrieving the information about that one user. Yes? Okay, so those are the only two cases, I guess, the generic cases. If I want to create a new user, like if I'm registering, I would use post, right? HTTP post. And I would tell you what is it that I'm creating. I'm creating a user. Yes? I would use this URL. I would post to this URL, and I would need to provide you with some user object. Some user object that contains all the data for the user. Now that data typically is encoded in the body of the HTTP request, right? So in the body of the HTTP, you'll have the usernames and passwords and whatnot that the server needs to retrieve, right? It needs to parse it out and then reconstitute it on the server and then insert it in the database and whatnot. If I wanted to remove a user, I would use an HTTP delete, right? I would provide the API, user, and then the ID of the user I want to remove. See that? Everybody okay? Right. And finally, if I want to manipulate, I want to update the user, I would use the HTTP put, and that would be API user. I need to provide the ID of the user that I want to update, right? And I need to provide you with the new data for that user, right? Maybe a new email, new phone number, new address. Make sense? So this is what we mean by an API, following being RESTful. Okay, there are many APIs out there from third-party providers that that call themselves being RESTful API, but that's more for marketing. They're not really RESTful APIs. They all do just everything with gets. Everything with get. They don't use post or delete or put. And they do that to simplify the developer's life, right? These two can always be generated from the URL in your browser, right? When you type something in the URL of the browser, it generates a get, right? But there's no way from the URL of the browser to generate a post or a put or delete, right? So if you want to try out an API, want to test it and see, you just want to play around with it, you can't easily generate a delete or post or put. So to simplify that, they only do gets. They only use gets. Anyway, so let's look at some of the examples here. Let me share my screen again. All right, so Express.js. Yeah, so that experiment is lectures, Node.js Express. Lectures, Node.js Express. And that's hello. Okay. Let's look at another example. On to retrieving a JSON array. Okay, so here's retrieve the JSON array, and we're using Angular to retrieve the array, and then we're rendering it as a table down below. Okay, so let's see how that works. It is using the API cores array, so this is what's coming back from the server. So let's see how we are doing. What are we doing from the client? So from the client side, we're declaring this to be an Express app in the ng app, and we have a controller at the top called an Express controller, which is going to provide the data for the table that is going to be used to render all the courses. See that? Let's see how the controller retrieves the data. So here's the Express app being declared. We declare the controller, and then the controller, there it is. Look, it uses $HTTP.get to go and fetch the course. See that? Now some might say, wait a minute, but if it's in course, many courses in a collection of courses, shouldn't that be plural? Courses, right? Because many courses, right? I don't like plurals. Plurals are not consistent, right? Some words don't have plural. So it would be just one more thing to have to remember when you're coding. So it's just easier to just say we're always going to use singular. So we don't have to say, oh, what was the API? Was it course, courses? What was it? Is it fish or fishes? Oh no, wait, fish doesn't have plural. So some words don't have plural, so it's easy to just stick to singular. So yeah, so I'm asking for a course. I'm not asking for any particular course. So in the response, I'm going to get the array of courses. I map it to my variable courses, which then is used to iterate over the ng repeat. Right, so that's simple. That's easy. Everybody okay? That's easy. Let's look at another example. Drop down. So here's an example that retrieves exactly the same list of courses, retrieves the same exact one, but the response is used to populate this dropdown. Okay, and it might be different than what you expect. So let's look at the implementation. So to implement that, the server declares the array of courses, right? It's waiting for the request and a response with the array of courses. In the JavaScript in Angular, we retrieve the courses just like we did earlier. Okay. I'm not showing the HTML. Let's look at the HTML page source. In the HTML, the drop down, there it is. This is a select. See that? Let's look at the select. So courses, the courses that comes back to the server, right? And made available in the response and put it in the scope. Yes? And now we're going to iterate over them. We'll say for each course in courses, but notice that we don't have any option elements in the select statement. You see that? Right? We're not ng repeating. We're not using ng repeat to repeat each one of the option in the select. You see that? Instead, we're using ng-options. That's an Angular attribute that you give it a collection, and it's going to use that collection to iterate and generate all the options inside of the select. Right? As it's iterating over the courses, each course is an object, right? And the object has what? Has a title for the course, has the number of seats, has the date, the start date, right? We need to tell the select, right, what to use to render as the label for the option. Yes? Right. Notice that we're using what? We're using the title of the course. You see that? We're not using the seats. We're not using the start date. We need to tell it that we want the title. And that's exactly what we do here. We're saying for the course title of each course in the courses. That's what it says, right? It says, I want to use the course title to render the options. See that? Everybody okay? All right. Right. Now, as I interact with this dropdown and I select one or the other, okay, notice that at the bottom, right, notice that it's changing, right? Right? And that's because we are tying the selection, the current selection, whenever you select, right, we're tying it to a model. You know, as you select, just like an input field, right? As you type an input field, right? Usually that's tied to an ng model variable, which gets notified everybody, right? Everybody gets notified as the ng model changes. Now this is a little bit different because in an input field is just a scalar value, right? It's just a piece of text. But here the data is an object, right? As you select different options, you're actually really selecting different objects, right? Either the first course object or the second course object or the third course object. So this is being bound to here, the select course, right? And then it's being used down here to just render the selected course title, seats, and the dates, the start date. And that's how as I choose this, notice that this is changing down below. See that? As I choose, the seats change, the start date changes. Notice the start date though. The start date is being rendered. It's being rendered with these, you know, like a short version of a date, short month name. But the data that's coming back is this ugly string that represents the date. See that? The data. This is the raw data that's coming back. But we chose to format it as a date. See that? This bar here, this bar is an Angular bar, right? It's called a filter. It's an Angular filter that says, take the raw data and apply it the following filter. There's a whole bunch of filters. There's filters to format currency, right? Lengths, distances, dates. Okay, and right now the date filter, that's part of the Angular framework. It's one of the many filters that are available. You can configure it. You can tell what format you want to format it. It's using the default format. The default format is to use the short version of the month, day, comma, and then the year. Make sense? And you can create your own filters, just like you can create your own controllers, your own directives, your own services. You can create your own filters, and then you give them names, right? And the way they work is that basically what happens is that the data is sent to the filter, and then the filter can manipulate the data and then respond with the manipulated or altered piece of data. Okay, what else? All right, enough with that one. Go on to the next one. Passing path parameters. So here we have the same URL we had earlier, but we can pass parameters, right? 1 or 2, right? And gets different or nothing. If you get nothing, you get all the courses, right? So what we're doing here is that as we're selecting, notice what's happening. We're displaying the details down below in 2 places. One of them is the object that we're currently selecting, right? As we select, it becomes a selected course, right? We did earlier in the model. The other one, the one down below, is data that is being fetched from the server dynamically. And notice that they're the same. Obviously, they have to be the same, right? This is a local cached model, whereas this is a data that is being dynamically fetched from the server. So let's look at the source to this, right? So we have the select, and we have the selected course, and so that's how this piece is being updated, right? As I select different courses, the object, the corresponding object, is being bound to this variable selected course, and then I'm using it to render elsewhere in the page, right? In the second row, we're displaying the course, but this is a fetched course. I'm going to go fetch the course by ID from the server. I'm going to bring it back, and then I'm going to display it here. Yes? And hopefully they're the same. Hopefully they're the same, right? So let's see. How do we fetch this course? Let's see. Well, we have in the dropdown, we have an ngChange function, right? We're saying that if this dropdown changes, I want to notify my controller through this function, right? The function is called select course. And my controller is the express controller. So there has to be a function select course in that controller. So way down here, right, here's my application, here's my controller, here's my express controller. Here's my initial set of courses is an empty array. But right away when the controller gets initialized, I go and fetch all my courses right away. And I send them to the UI through the scope. I say, scope, here are your courses. Here, page, here are your courses. Render the dropdown. Yes? Okay. And then I declare an event handler, right, for the select course, right? When I change that dropdown, it's going to invoke this function, right? Because that's what we said, right? We said ngChange, right? ngChange, and we said select course way down here, yes? Yeah, ngChange, select course down here. So this function gets invoked when I select a different course. What do? Well, we have the currently selected course in the scope, right, under select course. We look it up in the array, right? Where are you in the array? We find the index. Now that we have the index of where that course appears in the local array, we can go back to the client, to the server, with that index and retrieve that one course. Yes? We can retrieve that one course. Once we have the course, in the response, we bind it to the local fetched course variable in the scope, and that's how this div gets populated. You see that? Right? That's how I select here. Notice how the top one is slightly faster, gets slightly faster updated than the one below, right? Because this one is a local object in the local array, right? Whereas this is being fetched dynamically from our server. Yes? Right, so if I go Angular, see that one is a little slightly before the other one. Okay? Make sense? Everybody okay? We're still with me? All right. And we can see the chatter. We can see the network chatter. Well, if we go to inspect, right, and we look at the network chatter, right, as I select this, there it is. There it is. See that? If I select here, I go to the last one. That's number 4. If I click here, I can see the URL that went out to the server. There it is, API course 4. We can see the preview of the response. See, start, the title, the raw response that came back. You see that? So we're retrieving this data from our local server. So our server is gonna become this big hard drive, right? That we're gonna fetch data, because us as an Angular client, we don't have any data, right? The server has the data. So we're gonna use the server like a one big hard drive retrieving the data. Adding content. Okay, this one uses post to create new content, right? So it retrieved the courses and it displayed them in this table, but we can create new courses. Let's create knitting 1, 2, 3. Very popular course. And we created, so this generated a post to the server, and then the server pushed the new instance into its array, and then responded back to us with all the objects in the current course. So if we look here and we post again, we look at the network, right? So paper plane, even more popular. And we click on plus, we see that we're posting to the URL localhost 3000 API course, but it's a post this time. See that? It's a post. We're passing the data. This is the data that is in the body, right? And then the response is that it comes back with all the courses, including the new courses that I've added. Make sense? Right? And finally, the last one is I want to remove, right, existing courses so that I can, notice that knitting and paper planes is still there, right, because it's being stored in the array in the server. I can remove these by index. Okay? Makes sense? Anyway, the server implementation is right here, server.js. Here's a server. Here's a hello world, hello. This is the JSON that we looked at earlier, right? That responds just with a single course. This is the array of the courses. And here's the get all the courses with no ID. All courses if you give me one ID, right? The way that we retrieve the ID is through using the request. The request parses the URL, and if it finds colon, it says, this is not a hard-coded piece of text. This is a parameter, right? It parses the value and it creates a map inside the request. The map is called params, request.params. And then we can retrieve the parameter by name, ID, right? It maps to ID here. And we're going to use that as an index to return that particular course as an index. Delete, again, retrieves the ID as an index and splices out the course from the array, and then just returns all the courses. Post retrieves the JSON from the body in the request. So the request has a body, we have the local copy here, and we push it into our array and return that array. Okay. All right, we'll come back to and do some more of this. I'm losing my voice, and I see some of you are burnt out. So we'll revisit this on Thursday, and we'll do something from scratch and demo this. All right. All right. Thank you.